Well, hello, Larissa Lam, and welcome to the Teaneck International Film Festival. Thank you very much for sharing this amazing documentary about Americans of Chinese ancestry, or is the preferred term American Chinese?
Well, there's a few debates about the proper terminology. I like how you phrase that Americans of Chinese descent. Chinese Americans is also something that our community uses. So I appreciate you, trying to, I guess, properly identify us so that we're not always pigeonholed as just Chinese and distinguishing the two. Yes.
Okay. So you are, among other things, an award-winning producer, director, and you've written music. Um, you've served as a CFO of a record label. And before we talk about the film, if you will allow me, I just want to make sure the audience knows about this parody that you and your daughter did of the Jackson Five's ABC, which I found like just it was a funniest but very informational about Americans of Chinese ancestry, to the tune of ABC.
Yep.
So they should go and, very catchy tune. I know we're
Right.
not going to talk about that, but I just had to mention
Yeah,
that.
because that meant, and that was a good way to introduce it because, we're talking about that identity. It's like American born Chinese. And I think, part of the reason we made Far East Deep South is because a lot of people conflate, those who are born overseas with those who are American born. And, there have been numerous times where family members or even myself have been, you've heard the unfortunate racist rhetoric, go back to your country. And a lot of us who were born here were like, we were always here, like this is our country. So that's why we made that video and even Far East Deep South, so that we can kind of fight back against those misperceptions of the Asian community and the Chinese community here in the United States.
Well, congratulations on telling not only your story, but it is indeed an American story about so many of us. Now your husband, Baldwin Chu, um, talks about early in the film, he talks about unanswered questions about his ancestry, about his grandfather in particular, and his reluctance to talk to his father about his questions. I'm wondering, was it while you were dating or early? And when did you become aware of your husband's curiosity about his past?
Well, one of the things that was interesting was when we were getting married or when we were engaged, I should say, before we got married, and we're trying to make the guest list, right? And typically you would invite everybody on the groom side, and it would be, my mother-in-law's, or my future mother-in-law, future father-in-law's like family. And so when we got to Baldwin's father's side of the family, and I said, "Oh, who are we going to invite from his family?" It kind of went silent. He's like, nobody. And I'm like, "Oh, really?" And if you've ever been to a Chinese American or Chinese wedding, like you literally invite everybody and your mother, your cousin, your uncle, and so to me it was very, very odd that his dad had no one to invite. And
Hmm.
so I said, "Oh, should we ask him?" And Baldwin said, "No, it's kind of a sensitive subject." I'm like, "Oh, really?" And then I kind of just dropped it. And I think Baldwin had tried to inquire over the years, in more recent years about that side of the family, and it was really just shut down by his father. So that's why what unfolds in the film is kind of remarkable, because they went from having no answers or no info or very little information to what we uncover in the film.
And what I'm really curious about is, and I think, in fact, I know in the film, Baldwin credits you with, shall we say, prodding him to to look into it, and apparently, Mrs. Chu, Baldwin's mother, who also played a role on that. Could you just tell me about that process of, like, when did the topic come up again? How was it raised? How did you persuade your husband to eventually get his father to go to Mississippi?
Well, I'll give more credit to my sister-in-law, because I think it originated with my brother-in-law Edwin and his wife coming up with the idea. It was around their 40th anniversary, and so they said, "Hey, let's take a trip to Mississippi," because we had all never gone to as a family to Mississippi. And I said, "Yeah, sure. I've never been to Mississippi. I think it'd be good to pay pilgrimage. I think paying respects to your elders, your ancestors, is a very important part of our culture." And so, in a sense, we thought we're just going to go put some flowers and come home. And so it didn't apparently take too much prodding, at least for me, to convince Baldwin. In fact, anything he probably had to convince, well, not convince me more, but he had to explain things a little bit more to me. And I think, mom being excited really kind of pushed dad, Baldwin's dad, to be like, okay, let's all go as a family. And so I think it helped that our daughter by that time was 1 year old. And so at that, grandkids soften up a person, really. They do. And so I think we don't mention it in the film, but mom played a big part. But I think having a little granddaughter maybe
Mhm.
put him over the edge.
And so when you went on this trip, were you going with the idea of doing this documentary, or was it, or were the visuals that we see, the pictures, just a family fun trip where we take a lot of pictures and do a lot of video, but not necessarily, you weren't thinking at that time, were you, or were you, about
Well, the
adventure
the
film?
very first trip that we went to in the film that you see towards the first half of the film, no, we had no idea we were going to make a film. Because our daughter was one, we were on a family vacation. We just naturally decided to capture our family vacation just for our own posterity, our own home video. And then as things started to unfold, we realized there was a bigger story, or at least I realized there was a bigger story here, because it was my crazy idea to make a documentary. And just because the history I had never known about. I grew up in California. I was born and raised in Southern California. I had learned about the American South, and that to me was very removed from my own, from what I'd heard or what I thought, was my experience as an Asian American. I thought, oh, that's just people fighting. It's black and white. It's about the Civil War and what happens, and Jim Crow didn't impact, anybody else. And then when we went to Mississippi and kind of learned the full history, I was just astounded about generations and thousands of Chinese and Chinese Americans that lived in the Delta and contributed and were also impacted by the Jim Crow laws of the time. And I thought, why don't we know about this history? Why don't more people know about this history? Because I know personally that gave me greater empathy for those in that community who had experienced it, but also it gave me a sense of belonging that you know what? I am part of American history, even though my parents had immigrated from China back in the 1960s. But and I was born here. I really felt disconnected to American history because I always just thought, white guys in powdered wigs, Revolutionary War, and again, it was black and white, and the Civil War, American South, and that I and people that looked like me were kind of not part of this country's history. So that was very profound and a big catalyst to why I wanted to make the film.
And not part of it until the building of the railroad.
Yeah, and and then we kind of disappear, right? We build the railroads, we disappear, and then we're not heard of again, until, or at least the Chinese narrative kind of stops, and then you hear about Japanese internment in 1940s. But it's not like we went anywhere. We actually stayed in the country. There was and went to other parts of the country, and those narratives just weren't told. And so that's why I really wanted to bring these stories to the forefront. And in this case, it was the history of the Chinese in the Mississippi Delta, but also the personal side of that history, which had kind of those amazing discoveries. And if people have watched the film, I don't want to spoil it too much. They will have known some of those surprises that happen, and I'm sure you may ask me about them. But
Yeah.
those two things really propelled me to say, home movie needs to be something more, everyone.
Well, actually, as you know, they've seen the film, and one of the pivotal moments for me, almost a teary moment, was when the director of the cultural center, the
The Mississippi Delta Heritage Museum.
yes, and Mr. Chu is describing his grandfather,
His father,
his father rather, right?
Casey
And
Lou, yeah.
he goes and pulls the box. Was that the first trip?
That was the first trip. That was the, and in that section, we pretty much ran everything. Everything was in sequence as it happened. And
Yeah.
so, because I've had people ask me, it's like, is that really what happened? I'm like, I could not make this up. Like, I really couldn't.
And that's what I really want. How did you know? I mean, okay, if I'm, in my role as a reporter
Hmm.
and I'm not staging and someone looks a certain way, I'll ask myself, yeah, shoot that. Did you know that she was going to go and get something special?
No, we
Because
had no idea.
she reaches up on the shelf and she takes the box down. Oh my gosh, I'm getting goosebumps when I'm thinking about it.
Hmm.
Opens the box up and there's the Bible.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, what was that like in that moment for you, for the family there?
I think it was pure shock. First off, as I mentioned earlier, we really just thought we were going to go to a gravesite, put some flowers, go back to California, probably never go back to Mississippi again. And then we find this museum, a
Oh,
Chinese
you didn't
museum
know
in the middle of Mississippi, right?
you didn't know the museum was there before you
Well,
came.
so what happened, I think my brother-in-law mentions this in the film. He called City Hall maybe about a month or two in advance, and
Mhm.
they told him about the museum. And so we did find out about it, and it was one of those things like, oh, should we go? Okay, sure, we'll stop in. We could have gone there, and she could have not been there, right? She was there, and the fact that she found something, and the fact that it was a Bible was also significant. To their family just because Baldwin's family were Christians. And, we always say, like, if we had found a dictionary, like, it wouldn't have had the same impact, right? Like,
Mhm.
because of what it was, what it meant to the family, and where faith played a role in their life, like, it had that extra impact. And so I'm getting teary eyed thinking about it, even though I've seen the movie like 500 times and I was there in that moment. But there's 5 minutes of lost footage of my father-in-law crying in a corner. Um, and something we've had that couple of times happen during this trip where I had filmed, I turned the camera onto my father-in-law, Charles, for his reaction. And for some reason, there was some error that happened in the camera. And in many ways, I feel like maybe that was a good thing because he needed to maybe reserve some moments for himself to emote. And so there is like 5 minutes of lost footage where he's just crying in a corner uncontrollably. I mean, you see a little bit of it in our film,
Yeah.
and there's a shot of, or at one point my little daughter who was one like runs up to grandpa and hugs his leg.
Oh my
And
God.
yeah, and again, I was there when it happened, and it's kind of now, for whatever reason, lost footage. We might have had a tail end of it somewhere, but yes, it was very, very emotional.
Whew. Wow. Film about the film. So the other amazing, serendipitous thing that happens is the older residents in the area who knew um, Charles Chu's father
Or grandparents as
and
well.
El
Yeah.
Grand, they
It's
start
16
showing
hours.
up and calling you and saying, "I knew you." Tell me about that. I mean, I'm thinking about what's this? Frida, well, no, well, Frida Kwan. I guess she still lives there.
She does, yeah. I mean, the first person we
Oh,
met,
John Bassey and
John Bassey is the first one. That was on the same day. I think what was remarkable for that first trip, all these encounters in Mississippi happened like on one day within like 6 hours. Like we didn't really say that. I was almost going to put a timer on the film to kind of show like the time of day. We ended up
Mhm.
not doing it because we thought it would cause a little bit of confusion. But like that first day, honestly, by the finding the Bible, going to the museum, finding the Bible, then meeting John Bassey, meeting Woods Eastland, like that all happened within the span of like 6 hours. And going to the gravesite, like that all crazy stuff happened in like 6 hours. So we met John Bassey, who remembered Baldwin's grandfather, Casey Lou, and even knew the location of the store, took us to Pace, Mississippi. The store, unfortunately, as you see in the film, the physical building isn't there anymore, but the plot of land is there.
Mhm.
And so that was like a remarkable thing to happen. I mean, part of it is I don't know that the magic of a small town is people, the word gets around quickly, but we definitely believe it was serendipitous. It was a God incidence in many ways, like we like to call it. But that was yeah, that was a remarkable day.
Um, as you know, I'm from Mississippi. I was born not too far from where your in-laws ancestors lived. I never knew anything about the presence of Chinese Americans in Mississippi until way into my adulthood. Yazoo City, I don't think, I don't recall. I mean, I didn't grow up in Yazoo. I grew up in Jackson,
Right.
but I was there a lot. I don't recall any Chinese stores or anything of that sort in Yazoo City. However, looking at your documentary, I also did not know that Chinese Americans initially came to Mississippi to do the same kind of work that previously enslaved people have been doing, working in the fields. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so obviously after emancipation, there was a need, there was a void, right, that was created of losing a lot of the labor. So, like other parts of the country, where did the plantation owners turn for the labor that they now have lost? They turned to China. So they had heard that, oh, they've done a good job with the railroads and in other industries in the country. So let's go recruit. And so a bunch of planters got together in a convention in Memphis to address this issue and actually recruited 300 to 400 men from China, in addition to other labor that had migrated to the region post transcontinental railroad completion. And so that was the next wave of laborers that they ended up contracting to become sharecroppers, almost indentured, servants in a sense. And so that was how a lot of the initial wave, the first wave of Chinese that came into the Delta, and they were because of the farming, which is why you probably didn't have as strong as a presence in Jackson, even though obviously there is farming all across, but the rural areas along the Delta, and at its peak there were probably over 400 Chinese run grocery stores all around the Delta. So it wasn't just like a few stores here, a few stores there. I mean, there was actually a very, very strong presence in all the Delta towns.
Well, hats off to them for being able to get out of the field into stores, beat the heck out of chopping cotton. Um, but here's another question. Just looking at the film, it appeared to me that the relationship between white Mississippians and Chinese was closer, and the way they talked about um, Charles's father and grandfather, very cordial. But what was the relationship of that Chinese community to the Black community who also lived in that area?
Yeah, I mean, we touched upon it a little bit in the film, but one of the things that I wish that we discovered after the making of the film that we uncovered was there was a photo of an African American man in Baldwin's father's, things that were passed down. And we were trying to find out who this man was because, back in those days, taking a photo was a lot, right? It's not like today on our cell phones where you can just snap away. It cost a lot. It took time. And if you're going to preserve a photo of someone, like they had to be somebody important. And so, his father had mentioned that there was a man, this man in the photo, his grandmother had told him he was really important. He was a really good man. And so later on, we found out from some of the residents, and unfortunately, this was after our film was done, is that his name was Hosey Collins, and apparently and you heard a little bit from Mayor LaVon Jackson in our film, but there was kind of this under the radar relationship, I should say, with the Black community because of the societal restrictions that were on. And I'm talking we're talking pre 1960s, 50s, because during the time period that Baldwin's grandfather and great grandparents, it was, he passed away in 1946. So pre 1946, very different. So with Hosey Collins, we learned that Hosey had a farm and Casey had his store, and they would kind of barter with one another. So Hosey would help take Casey in a store, and then Casey would go help Hosey on his farm. So there was kind of this mutual friendship that developed. But again, it was a little under the radar. I mean, unfortunately, because of the societal norms and even laws at the time. This isn't very broad. A lot of these relationships weren't broadcast. So on the surface, yes, there is, of course, sadly, the Chinese, of course, are going to want to be accepted by white society because they're the ruling and dominant society. But behind the scenes, there was many instances where there was a lot of cooperation because they had to kind of, again, barter with one another. There was the story about loaning credit, no interest, just to help the sharecroppers be able to buy groceries. There was a lot of helping in that way, but on the societal level, on the outward appearances, of course, the segregation, as we heard from a lot of the Chinese, they were stuck in the middle. And so, there were times where people did, as the decades went on, people were integrated a little bit more, but certainly in the strictest parts of segregation, there was much more of a dividing line where Chinese stores were a safe haven, I think, for the Black community to go to, but there wasn't necessarily as much, outward fraternizing, hanging out each one of other's homes. But when they were at the store, it was, people, it was like family, and people were very friendly.
I noticed that one of the African American people from the community that you interviewed talked about being able to get food on credit, which was something, well, all sharecroppers had to do that. Of course, if the store was owned by the plantation owner, the accounting might be a little bit screwy, which is to say that at the end of the year, Black farmers in many instances ended up with nothing. But of course, if you were going to a friendly store, then you get a good deal and you wouldn't have to pay everything that you had possibly made in the field. Here's another question I was wondering about, and I'm sure you know about this as well. There were many communities across the South and out of the South, really, but especially in the South, where African American people had built up businesses, stores, own homes, and white people who were not as wealthy didn't like it and came and burned it down. I'm talking about Wall Street in Tulsa. I'm talking about
Right.
in Florida.
Yeah,
In a
Elaine,
lot of
yeah,
places. Yeah,
Arkansas.
I'm wondering if as Chinese Americans were able to build their businesses, whether they ever encountered the same kind of attacks of response from from the white community.
Yeah, there were some instances in later decades, that occurred. They weren't as widespread as the ones that you had mentioned, but certainly in certain neighborhoods there was started to become hostility towards that. I think, kind of the dividing line is again back to like kind of pre-civil rights and post-civil rights. I think pre-civil rights, it was not like they were not as seen as a threat. I think post-civil rights, just as the Black community was also seen as a threat, things started to get a little, I think, dicier as people started to, increase in numbers, and that's their way of kind of scaring people off to not increase in numbers is the nice way to put it. But it's definitely not to the same hostility. In other parts of the country, in the Western United States, you saw that exact same happen in California, in Rock Springs, Wyoming. There was a massive riot. There was in Washington, in the Pacific Northwest, you had in Seattle and other areas, Bellingham, there were a lot of race riots and burning, very similar to what you describe in Tulsa and other parts of the country. So in the Mississippi Delta, again, because I think the numbers of Chinese Americans were much smaller and less of a threat, we didn't see
Mhm.
that as much. It was more kind of on an individual, like town by town basis. But on the western half of the United States, there definitely was a lot of that violence to Chinese Americans.
Before we run out of time totally, I have to ask you two quick things here. Well, they're not really quick, but the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1878, I guess it was,
1882 was the first act that was
1882,
passed, yes.
and then it was rescinded in 1943. But the Chinese Exclusion Act set up the predicate for the immigration system as we know it now. Could you just
Yes, it is.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
it
so
definitely.
so, so who was were all Chinese excluded or were just women excluded? I mean, how did that work?
So there were actually waves of legislation without getting into the weeds a little bit more, which is kind of like how our country works. It started in 1875, I believe, with the Page Act, which targeted women, Asian women, and had put restrictions on them coming because they were seen as a threat to become prostitutes. But part of it too is, again, going back to reducing numbers. It's like if you have women here, then they're going to procreate with the men that are here, and then all of a sudden your population is going to grow. So that was one way to kind of stop that. Then we had the passage of the 1882 Exclusion Act, and that ended up banning laborers specifically because they're stealing our jobs, as the quote to say. Sound familiar? You know, there's everything old is new again, right? And so that's what happened is they were, and it was specifically targeted to ethnicity, and it's the only law that's actually specifically targeted to ethnicity. Today, the laws are by country of origin, and that Chinese Exclusion Act is the only one. So you could have been Chinese, born in Canada, born in United Kingdom, you know, anywhere else in South America, but you still would have been banned from coming in as a laborer. There were some exceptions, like you could have been a scholar or diplomat, or a merchant, and that was but aside from that, they were banned from coming to the country and could not become naturalized citizens. And kind of to your question or kind of your point earlier of the Chinese moving from the plantations to the stores, that was also part of the reason, because come 1882, now you actually can't work on the fields as a laborer. And so now the loophole is becoming a merchant, and hence going into industries such as a store, or in other parts of the country, you see Chinese restaurants, you see Chinese laundry, because they are now no longer allowed to work on railroads or on farms and labor industries. So in some ways, this law opened it up some other doors for them, but it was actually meant to keep, you know, because running businesses were not easy. It was back then. People were making pennies. It was actually a way to deter Chinese from coming into the country and staying in the country.
And your film notes that just as what happened for Black folks, you had your own Chinese schools, your own neighborhoods. You couldn't live in the white neighborhood or the Black neighborhood, so you lived behind your stores for the most part. Just crazy. Look, before we run out of time, I noticed in your bio that you're referenced as a frequent speaker on issues of diversity and inclusion with respect to Asian Americans. So here's the question. As everyone knows, there are parts of the country where books are being banned, where certain topics, especially diversity, equity, and inclusion, are being outlawed from even being mentioned. But at the same time, you are trying to make sure that more people know this untold story, which involves diversity and race.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you dealing with this counter movement that's taking place in parts of America now?
Yeah, I think it's a big issue that we get asked about all the time. I mean, when we made this film, we started making this one. The first trip that we took to Mississippi was in 2014, and we finished the film in 2020. Something happened in 2020, I don't know, worldwide pandemic. And all of a sudden, you know, it was more about the social unrest and you know, the anti-Asian sentiments. And then the last few years is where we started to get asked about this very question that you pose. One of the things I always like to give is this analogy, and I try to do this in a way that's not polarizing, where we're just shouting down people like, no, you're wrong, we need to include this. And a lot of it is because people fear that we're replacing their history, right? People in the dominant white society are just like, we want to make sure we preserve our history and not change it, and not anybody in. But that's if you're under the assumption that we were never part of the picture, right? So I use this analogy of a photo album. Maybe you're in a family photo album, you flip through the pages a million times, and you've seen a photo that's got the corners bent over. And you've just seen it that way all the time, where it's covering some other members of your family. One day you decide to finally open that page, take the photo out, uncurl those corners of that photo. And you're like, oh, wait, we've got some extra family members in here. For whatever reason, whether it was intentional or accidental, because it could have been either, that's the full picture. It's not like we're trying to add people into the photo. The people were always there. Chinese, Americans were here, African Americans were here, Latinos were here, indigenous people were here. There were a lot of people that were here in this country, but we were just never shown the full photo. So we're not trying to replace the photo. We're not trying to diminish the photo. We're just trying to uncover the full picture of American history, and our stories. And that's kind of the way I've been illustrating it, so that people know it's like, our stories are not a thread. And the other thing I say is, I know sometimes we can get very territorial and possessive about our stories. And one thing I say is, like, you know what? Your history is also my history. I think about learning about American history. I learn about all the founding fathers. That is part of my history as an American. Even though I am not Caucasian and of European descent, that's still part of my history, and I need to learn it. At the same time, those who are Chinese, who came into this country, those who were enslaved and brought over from Africa, that's part of our nation's history. Like, that is all our history. Our histories are connected. And I think the more we feel a collective ownership of this history, it's not going to be like, your history is more important than mine, and, my history needs to be in there. We need all of it. It's not about your history needs to be first, mine needs to be second. It's like all that history, that whole photo needs to be seen and needs to be told.
Well done, Larissa Lam. That probably is a very good place to stop. However, Karen Sachs knows I won't do that. There's one more thing I have to point out, which is the letter that Charles Chu's father wrote one of his friends in Mississippi was saved. It was that typewritten letter where he expressed the desire of wishing he could be with his son. This is
Right.
obviously before his death. The typewritten letter that this white family had saved all of these years.
It was actually not a white family. It was the Chinese family that bought the store.
Okay. The Chinese family bought the store. But that just shows how important the history is.
Yeah.
That your father-in-law, because of this letter, he gets a new appreciation, a new realization about the feeling that his father had for him that he didn't know before.
Yeah, that letter was remarkable because, again, it's almost like the Bible. Like, out of all the letters they could have saved, it could have just been, oh, the war. He was writing it, and so the person that Casey Liu, Baldwin's grandfather, was writing to was his friend J.W. Dunn, who was overseas serving in the World War II, and so he was just writing about how he was feeling back home. And I am so glad that J.W. Dunn kept that letter all those years, and the scrapbooks, because otherwise we would have never had that. I'm getting a little emotional now that my father-in-law has passed on, but I was like, we were able to restore his memory, and not restore, but give him a memory, a good memory of his father, because he had grown up all his life thinking that his father had abandoned him and had stayed in the United States and left him at China, and the fact that his father loved him so much and would have traded everything. I mean, that was so significant. And again, it goes back to the ties that bind us. I mean, we've showed the film and for so many audiences, and no matter your racial or ethnic background, if you grew up with a father or grew up with the difficult relationship with a father, we've had so many grown men cry and women cry and say that moment resonated so much that, again, crosses cultural and racial boundaries of a human experience that we all share. And so I'm so glad that we were able to give that experience of having a father's love to my father-in-law in his last 10 years of his life. And I'm glad that we've been able to prompt people to try to heal some relationships with their fathers as well.
Well, may the memory of Charles Chu be a blessing. And thank you, Larissa Lam, Director of Far East Deep South, for sharing your story with the Teaneck International Film Festival.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful, insightful questions. And, I really hope that people will take away from this film this history that they can share with other people, and also know that each and every person's history makes up our American history. It's not just about who's president, it's not just about wars, but our family's history make up this country's history. And I think the more that we can tell these stories, and especially for those stories that have been typically excluded, and have those pages curled over in the photo, the more we can tell this, I think the richer our nation is.
Well said. Thank you.